She has long uncovered the stories that are all around us, yet are hidden in plain sight, starting with her first book, At Home with History, 15 years ago, through to 2018's Murder by Milkshake, and her most recent book, Vancouver Exposed, in 2020. Now she's back with a new book highlighting some of the hundreds of unsolved murders in British Columbia. Here to talk about Cold Case BC, the stories behind the province's most intriguing murder and missing persons cases, is author, journalist, blogger, and podcaster extraordinaire, Eve Lazarus. Welcome back, Eve.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
One of the things that made this book possible is the advancements in forensic technology, specifically DNA and DNA databases. What difference do you think that's made in the cases profiled in this book?
Quite a bit. With my earlier book, Cold Case Vancouver, it was just unsolved murders. And this one, I really wanted to look outside of Metro Vancouver, and I wanted to look at unsolved murders still, particularly historical ones, but also look into missing persons cases and look at cases that have been solved after a really long time, after decades. And two things, I guess, happened, and they became news. You know, the two young people from Saanich, Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kellenberg, were murdered in 1989 in Washington. And that case has gone cold for 40 years. And it was through genetic genealogy that they found the killer. And it's just a game changer for everything. This guy was just, he'd never done anything before or since. And his DNA was nowhere. And if not for this, the magic, I guess, of genetic genealogy, of being able to track down his family, that never would have been solved. And then the Babes in the Woods, this case that I've been obsessed about for decades now and wrote about in detail in Cold Case Vancouver. The two children were finally identified this past February, again through genetic genealogy. And it's just become a complete game changer. And we're seeing every day, like dozens of cases that are being solved south of the border, missing people and unsolved murders. It's really quite amazing.
Now, the Babes in the Woods story that you referred to there, these are two children who went unidentified for nearly 75 years. And it was a story that you broke yourself this year. What happened there?
Just to back up a bit, these were two skeletons that were found in Stanley Park in 1953. They'd been there for several years, and the skeletons at that point were deteriorated. They had been given to the Vancouver Police Museum and put on display there, which had actually saved them to some extent. And they're also taken unbelievably to the P&E and put on display there, the skulls. But it also in some way preserved them. So when DNA came out in the 90s, they made this incredible discovery that the skeletons were not a girl and a boy as had been thought for 50 years and investigated. They were actually two boys. But the bone fragments were very old and degraded, and there weren't very many of them. And the coroner's office didn't really have a lot of hope that anything would happen. And then finally last year, they were able to get some DNA from the oldest skeleton, and they were able to do the genome sequencing and everything you need to do to put it in the database, which they did, and they got hits. And I'd heard that they'd been identified, but I didn't know anything else. And I was waiting along with everybody else to see what was happening. And then I got a message from this young lady who said that the police had been to see her and that the Babes in the Woods were her great uncles. And she'd gone online. She'd never heard of the Babes in the Woods. The family didn't know anything about it. And she'd gone online. She'd found my podcast that I'd done about them and got in contact. She wanted more information, which I was happy to provide. And it turned out that the story in the family had always been that her grandmother had two younger brothers, but the family was so poor during the war years that they'd been taken by social services. And it was a very sad thing for the family, and they didn't know what had happened. So a couple of things happened. The grandmother, who was the older sister to the Babes in the Woods, was still alive, but not very well. And they'd taken a swab from her just to find out their ancestry. And then Ellie, the granddaughter, had decided she'd really like to find out who these great uncles were. She thought they could still be alive. They'd be in their 80s. If they weren't alive, they'd have some family. And so she spat in a tube and sent it off to ancestry.com, and all this happened. And so it was a bit of a miracle. And so when we were putting it together, the story, she had sent me a lot of the photos that had come, and we had a photo of Derek, the older boy, at Henry Hudson Elementary School in Kipsilano. And it was just a bit of a mystery why he was never found, because I know the police over the decades, have really gone through this thoroughly, gone through school records looking for missing children, and never came up with this name. So it was really fascinating.
So you have a Facebook group, a podcast, and now another book. What is it about these cases that we find so fascinating?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. First of all, there's so many. I mean, certainly it was frightening how many I had to pick from. A lot of them were the families coming to me with cases that I'd never heard of. And I found them fascinating. Just talking about Brenda Byman, this was a case in 1961 out of Invermere that divided a town, that 60 years later, the grandchildren are now in a basic feud. It was incredibly, apart from the sadness of her missing, it was this incredibly interesting story about, this whole culture and society and what's happened to it. And the missing women and murdered women along the highway of tears, it's just so awful. I really wanted to bring more attention to that. There's been a lot recently, fortunately, and wanted to go back to the first one in 1969 and talk to her family. And but yeah, so it's a lot out there.
All right. The name of the book is Cold Case BC, the stories behind the province's most intriguing murder and missing person cases. My thanks to author Eve Lazarus.
Thanks so much, John.